Hi, you're listening to Boggy Talk, Faith Conversations in the Mud, a resource of Church on Bayshore. Boggy Talk is recorded on Boggy Bayou in Niceville, Florida, and is hosted by Justin Wyatt and James Ross, pastors at Church on Bayshore. We typically want every matter of faith and life to have crystal clear answers, but it isn't always that easy. This podcast digs in to help Christians think with a kingdom mentality about topics that sometimes get muddy and bog us down. So let's dive in.
Hey, and welcome to Boggy Talk. We hope you are not melting in this scorching heat that is outside, and hope you're doing well. Hey, we got an interesting topic coming up today and next week. We're doing a two-part take. So we're going to talk through some issues related to the most recent Southern Baptist Convention. But before we dive in, someone who's not melting.
I'm not melting.
Not melting. How you doing, buddy?
It is very hot.
It is so hot. It's so hot. But you know what? It's not as hot because our new favorite Boggy Talk listener, Lisa Corley.
That's right.
A few weeks ago, we talked about how hot it is in our office because the AC's out and coffee, and she brought us iced coffee.
Yeah, we said we'd like some iced coffee, and she brought us iced
She listened,
coffee.
so we know that one person out there listens to us, and we feel so loved. But you doing okay?
Yeah, I'm good. So I again, hot. I was thinking we're kind of in that seat. We like kids camp this week, student camp next week. Got a little family vacation in July. So it's just kind of like we're all over the place, right now, which is a different kind of. It doesn't feel as busy as the school year, mainly because I don't have to get my kids up and going every morning.
Whew, thank you, Lord.
Specifically one of them, but we're all
the one who shall not be named.
Yeah, that's right.
We feel the same way.
She doesn't want me to mention
which one.
No, she would not mind me saying that she does not like getting up early in the morning.
Right. I'm with you.
In addition to Christy.
Yeah, we're at that point of summer too where we had a couple of weeks where there was nothing, and now every week has something that it's spoken for, with camp and
DR.
The DR mission trip, and then 4th of July and outreach, and then time off, and then it's August.
Who approved this time off for you, Justin?
Yeah, I know. I'm taking it no matter what. Oh, man. Well, hey, we are going to dive in today talking about the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yeah, I think some people are going to be super interested in this, and some are
all right, I'll
see
catch
you in a
next
couple
time.
weeks. Yeah.
So last week in Anaheim, California, the Southern Baptist Convention convened.
Doesn't that sound like an oxymoron? Anaheim, California, Southern Baptist Convention.
Oh, man, it is kind of funny. So they met last week, and we're going to talk about some of the things that happened because as a Southern Baptist church and a church that participates in the convention and participates in the cooperative program of the Southern Baptist Convention, it's good to know what's going on in the convention and what's going on. So first of all, when you say the word Southern Baptist Convention, that just sounds so boring to the average listener, oh wow. But it is very important. There's a lot of great things that happen, some celebrations.
It is boring too.
But it is to me, when I hear that, it sounds like a 3-day church business meeting.
Yeah.
Which it is kind of formatted that way. But I do want you to just explain, because you were there in attendance. People could watch online. I watched a good bit of it online. What's the meeting like? Explain the format a little bit for those of listeners who may have no clue.
Yeah. So as a reminder to our listeners, and maybe refreshment for some of our first-time listeners.
Refreshments sound very nice.
The Southern Baptist Convention actually only exists for 2 days.
2 days.
So, the Southern Baptist Convention is the meeting of churches that choose to cooperate together, who have similar doctrine and a shared vision to reach the nations through the strategy of the International Mission Board, the North American Mission Board, and some other organizations as well. And also the theological training of, our future ministers, if you will. So we meet for 2 days and basically get a report from the executive committee, and you get a report from the different entities like North American Mission Board and others as well, Lifeway. And then you have the opportunity to ask questions about those different reports to those different entities, and to bring new business to the group, and those matters will either be discussed further at that meeting, referred to the executive committee, or be brought up at a further meeting. I mean, I'm simplifying it, but that is essentially what's taking place. So there's some preaching mixed in, some worship mixed in, those kind of things.
So you mentioned the executive committee. So why don't you explain what the executive committee is and their function?
Well, so let's explain kind of how we're organized. So what happens is every year, a president of the Southern Baptist Convention is elected. It's a volunteer position, and their main job is to be the ex officio member of committees and the appointment of certain committees. One of the committees that they appoint is the Committee on Committees.
Isn't that a great term? Committee on Committees.
Which I actually had the privilege of serving on this year. So the Committee on Committees' primary responsibility is to bring forth the nominating committee. Mm-hmm. And that group is actually voted on by the Southern Baptist Convention. So on Tuesday morning, we presented the nominating committee, two representatives of every basically convention, state convention or territory convention, because some of them are smaller in number, so they don't, like Wyoming is mixed in with others. Anyway, and New England actually, because even though there's some high population, there's so few churches of Southern Baptists there. So maybe because they're called Southern Baptists. But anyway, that's another topic. Yep. So then that group is approved by the convention. The nominating committee then has the responsibility of appointing the trustees for the North American Mission Board, the International Mission Board, Lifeway, all the seminaries, basically all the entities. And the executive committee trustees are the ones who essentially handle the business of the convention, the planning of the meeting, those kind of things alongside the president. And there's a few staff positions because there's so much to do. So those trustees make up the executive committee who are, again, approved. So that nominating committee, for example, this year, will then bring forth the trustees for next year at the Southern Baptist Convention meeting in New Orleans.
So if we didn't lose you,
that might have bored you.
but all that to say, it's a simple structure, but also complicated at the same time because there's just so many people involved.
There's so many layers.
There's so many layers. Yeah. But the point is that there's a lot of different people. There's due process. There's accountability. There's wonderful teamwork and cooperation amongst churches. So one of the probably the most exciting parts of the convention is some of the reports from the entities and organizations. Yeah. So why don't you just share a little bit about some of the reports that were given
this year? Yeah. I mean, so the North American Mission Board, has a strategic emphasis on send cities. And so those are cities where there is a higher degree of unchurched population, and specifically where Southern Baptists have a low presence. So cities like Boston, cities like New York City, cities like even New Orleans, because even though that's in the South, there's so much Catholicism. And while we love everyone, we think there's serious errors in the Catholic Church, and often the gospel isn't being preached because of that. Anyway, all those strategic cities, Los Angeles, so they're really doing a great job of planting churches, and seeing sustained growth over a period of time. Now, some of these cities, a church of 250 is going to be massive, right? Mm-hmm. Where we, in the South,
don't necessarily think that. 250, that's all you got.
Yeah, and in Texas, they're like, your church only runs 1,000. What? Anyway, but we're like a tiny church in cities of Texas. But so that report. Again, the executive committee report, just kind of, getting some things tightened up. The direction there is good. And I would probably say we'll get to the sex abuse task force in just a minute, but the IMB report is probably always the best. And part of it is they do two things. And one of those is a sending celebration, where all those who have been commissioned to go and will be going overseas in the coming year share. And many of those have to be behind a screen because they're going to protected countries where, you can't just come in and say, hey, I'm here to share the gospel. So that's just a really powerful moment, probably the most powerful moment of the convention every year.
I'm sure. Yeah, that's exciting. So leading up to the convention this year, for the few who may follow convention politics, really there was, as normal, I guess, sadly normal, there was some contention.
Drama.
Yeah, there just is. It kind of is like a microcosm of like what it's like nationwide when there's a presidential election. There's just, you get sides and people who want to push forward what they believe is right. And while some of of that is a healthy tension, I think, of cooperating churches, like the heart of like, hey, we disagree on something and we're going to help each other go towards the common goal.
Right.
A lot of it is not healthy.
Right.
And so there was definitely some of that headed into the convention. So let's talk about some of those specific issues and the feelings headed into the convention. Really, what was the pulse before the convention?
Yeah, well, the pulse this year was interesting because the Guidepost Sex Abuse Task Force. So last year in Nashville, because of the recommendation of a messenger, and then the approval of this recommendation by the messengers there, so the people who were there and voted, including me, and Jeff Waits, who's a member of this church, we both went from our church last year, a sex abuse task force was appointed. So those were 7 or 9 members of the Southern Baptist Convention who were appointed by the president, because that was the job of the president. And they then used Guidepost, an independent organization, to do an investigation of Southern Baptist. And there was some contention about how that would happen. But anyway, it did happen. And we were, there was no attorney-client privilege. So everything was full disclosure. And that report was released a couple weeks ago. So I remember we talked about
that. So if you missed that episode of Boggy Talk, you can go back and listen to it. We recorded right after that was released, just with some thoughts on it.
So Twitter,
Twitter's where it all happens.
Twitter,
folks.
Of course, gives people the opportunity to respond and comment and say things.
And it basically makes everyone feel like everyone cares about every word they say.
Like some pastors feel like they should do a podcast on it and that people will listen to them. Hey, people listened.
Yeah.
People listened.
Well, our people care.
Random people listen too.
People who know us care.
And people who don't know us care.
Yeah.
I don't know why what they care about. But anyway, so that was, and we'll talk about that more. That was kind of the big deal. Like, just, and it was already like, here's what's going to be recommended. That was put forth. So I think it was more, what's the response of the convention going to be to this? And what's funny is, I'm like, duh, everybody's going to approve this. But because of social media, you see like this 5% on either side that are really loud. And this is true in culture. You begin to think like, do people really think like that? I'm not trying to be funny and mean here or anything like that, but
I have no idea what you're about to say.
And so in California, you think like all these people, like they want masks and they want lockdown and they hate DeSantis. Dude, every Californian I met just about said, man, we love your governor. I was like, that's weird because the news is telling us like people in LA, this is in LA, right? In Orange County, like people, the news is telling us like people think Florida's crazy, right?
Right. Yeah, it is. It is so wild because you think like people just online, especially in the media, it's just there's just this feeling of like, man, our world is going mad, and it is. Yeah. But you get those same people in a room, and like they actually are face to face. They're actually like, hey, we have a lot to talk about and hang out, and we probably disagree on this, but we're going to be decent to each other. It's just online specifically makes people so indecent, and it's so infuriating.
And we've talked about, I'm not anti-mitigation, but I was really like, man, are this many people like really this serious about this? And it's like, actually, like everyone I was talking to was like, man, I wish we wouldn't have been locked down so long. And I'm like, that's weird because, and that's not even necessarily what's voted on. And I think part of it is people tend to say, well, we don't want to upset this huge majority. And it's like, it's actually not the majority. So my point in getting on at all that is like with the SBC, again, I would just say, and we'll get to this probably next week, you have 5% that's like super fundamental and 5% that's super liberal on a lot of issues. And we tend to be pulled towards those directions when 90%, while there's some nuances, pretty much agree.
Yeah.
And so,
people play off that too.
Yeah,
it's like
I
people
know.
like stoke the fires on purpose
a
lot to really like, I'm going to push this button so I can, it's so exhausting.
So really, when you go there, it's actually way more peaceful than you would think.
You could even sense that watching online.
Yeah, remember last year in Nashville, like people were reporting it was trash, and it's like, no.
Yeah, even watching online, you can just tell. Like there's this, of course, there's individuals and pockets of people and groups of people who are probably mad about certain things, but in general, you could just tell there's a sense of peace and focus and humility and generosity towards each other, and really a focus on the gospel.
Yeah. So the sex abuse task force thing was pressing. thing. And then for the past few years, this group started called the Conservative Baptist Network, and their kind of passion is that this convention is going liberal drift in the convention, and a lot of it they tie to American politics and what's identity politics and critical race theory and all these things. And so they're like, the convention is heading in that direction as well. And so they are, there's a couple guys, one of them lives in this area, who are spending a lot of money or giving a lot of money to try and basically take back the ship, take back the convention, change the direction of the convention. And yet they continue to not, get voted in. But that's making a lot of noise. So those are the two things leading up to it,
Yeah. So we have the sex abuse task force, and then we have the whole, liberal drift thing. And we're going to talk about that in part 2.
Okay.
So right now, why don't we focus in, because I think a lot of people are interested in this, and not just interested in, but I think the reason many people are interested in specifically the sex abuse task force is because it's deeply personal to many people, because
you're right.
Many people have been personally impacted or have a family member or someone they love who've been impacted in some way by this. And so, and then culturally, it is receiving a lot of attention, which I believe is, appropriate, but specifically, for the Southern Baptist Convention and the report that was given before the convention met, and then the things that were voted on at the convention relating to the findings. Let's talk about that, because that was probably the biggest issue, or biggest issue, maybe not the right word, but it was probably the biggest deal headed into the convention that people were anticipating. What was going to happen? Were the recommendations that were given by the task force, were they going to be approved? Were they going to be embraced? Were there going to be modifications? So let's talk about that a little bit. What happened?
Yeah. So the sex abuse task force, Bruce Frank led that. I think he's pastor of Biltmore Baptist Church or Biltmore Church, in North Carolina. But he essentially, kind of shared why, we need to be passionate about the issue and, why it matters. And then they made 2 recommendations. One is to appoint another task force for basically for reform and implementation. So their job was to kind of look at it. They realized, hey, that job is done. Doesn't mean people from that task force can't be on this new one, but hey, the new president needs to appoint a task force that essentially begins to work implementation throughout all of our entities. And really, how do we ensure this happens less? So that was number 1. And then number 2 was ministry check, which is basically, a database where people's names would be put in within the Southern Baptist Convention when they have been credibly accused of some kind of offense. And really, their recognition is that 3% of people who basically only 3% of offenders actually get ever criminally charged, but many will get civilly charged. And that's you can't find that.
Right.
I mean, you could probably Google and find that, but it's kind of hard to find.
Yeah,
you have to dig. So the concerns so you'd be like, why is there anybody concerned with a group just trying to make us more right, and a group, having this ministry check website? Well, the concern is the losing of autonomy, because our polity, again, we're not the Catholic Church where the Pope says something and it trickles its way down, right? Like the head of the Southern Baptist Church is the local church, and so it's unique in that people don't really understand that, and so there's a trust level that happens when you're at a Southern Baptist church because you've had another experience at a Southern Baptist church. It actually goes the other way too, right?
Yeah.
Negative.
Exactly. Yeah. People are like, I've had a terrible, I don't want to ever be part of an SBC church again. Yeah.
Right. Because I was a part of one that, told me I can't wear a skirt or have to wear a skirt.
Yeah. Because they're all different. Yeah.
Right. So that there was just concern of, hey, we don't want to overreach, which I get. One guy said some good stuff, and then he dude, I don't know if you heard it. Then he said basically this was just identity politics, and this is just pandering, and all that. And there's a little bit of that. I mean, you have there's a little bit of PR here going on. I mean, there's no doubt, but that's not. I don't think that's the ultimate heart of most people. And then the ministry check is like the concern of people getting on that website and their career being over, their life being over,
Right.
when they weren't credibly accused. And, you know, while there's going to be a lot of things in place to ensure that doesn't happen, the reality is that's probably going to happen a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just like, would you rather err on that side or the err on the side of accuser, you know, repeat offenders? Like, I think that's what we're looking at are the numbers, because they say 86% of offenders, you know, do it again.
Right. Absolutely.
So, that's the hard thing about big level politics and big level leadership is you recognize, hey, there's going to be some errors here, and people don't want there to be any errors. You know what I mean? Like, you think about gun control, like that's a hot topic, and it's like people are going to die no matter what we decide. And so politicians are trying to make what's going to reduce that as big as possible. But people are like, no, this is how you'll have 0 people die of mass shooting. It's like, that's never going to be the world we live in. And that sounds so insensitive for me to say, especially if someone listening to me has had someone impacted by that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I think you mentioned this, and I think this was probably the biggest pushback for it, you know, was the we want our churches to remain autonomous.
Right.
Because if you know, Southern Baptist Convention, every Southern Baptist church is an autonomous church. There's not a bishop, there's not a presbytery above that church to tell them what they believe. There is a unifying Baptist faith and message that, you know, and cooperating churches would say we affirm this. So I think that was their biggest pushback. However, personally, I think that's just like silly, because they wouldn't want autonomy on other issues, you know, like you know, but also I think the issue of autonomy comes down to this, like, let's just say you are doing something wrong, like
me
as a person, as a leader of your family, as a, you know, husband, you're doing something wrong. Like, well, we're brothers in Christ. Like, I should go to you, right? Like, I'm not an authority over you in terms of how you manage your family, but I'm going to do that, vice versa. And it's like this issue of autonomy is like, you can't tell us how to handle our church, but if a church is handling something incorrectly, like, you should tell them, like, there needs to be some type of, and, you know, they wouldn't want this in other areas of doctrine or matters. And so I think, to me, the whole pushback of autonomy of the church is a little bit of a like red herring in terms of like that. It really is kind of a separate issue. Yeah.
I mean,
I think people are hiding behind that. I should say.
So part of it is like everything gets viewed through lenses, you know, and like there's a mentality from many people in the Southern Baptist Convention that there is an elite group, and that elite group maintains control. And, you know, there's some truth in that. I mean, certainly, you know, but you don't know motivation. Like, you know, 'cause for me, for example, so we had a team that recommended you be to this church. But like, for me, being involved in the process of hiring a worship pastor, like, I'd known you for, you know, 8 years at that time. And so my point was like, I just have a high level of trust for you. So I had a team that was involved, but could somebody look at it who looks at it through the lens of, well,
just
you know, which you didn't even necessarily make more money or anything like that coming here, but like, people could look at it and say, okay, James wanted his guy, and here's this guy getting this, you know, bigger church and all that stuff, which again, the church wasn't that much bigger than your previous church at the time. And, but my point is that people can view it through that lens. The reality of the situation is, I know, hey, I have this team because I don't know the church that well yet. I don't know for sure Justin is the right fit. I want them to make that decision. I'm going to give opinion. I have a lot of trust for you or character. And I think like at Aneheim, for example, you know, there's a big accusation that Kevin Azell just puts his friends in these positions, and they benefit financially. They do benefit financially from it. But the question is like, is he doing that because he's helping his friends, or is he doing that because these are the right people? And people are split on that. You know, like,
you don't really know. Like,
And the truth is, like, who are you? If my name was put on the committee on committees because someone on the executive committee knew I was a trustworthy guy, you know, like.
So it is about connections. Yeah.
So there's just, and there's always the tendency to see the same people, and, you know, but what I find is, you know, you can't view everything through that lens. And that's why accountability and questions and these committees and levels of committees are important. But, you know, the problem is that gets viewed. So then, you know, I was just thinking about it, you know, like, people are viewing, okay, here's the platform and they're telling us what to do, you know, and it's like, well, you know, not anybody can run.
Right. Anybody can be a part of it. So, specifically when it came time to like the voting and affirming the findings of the sexual abuse task force, like what was that like in the room?
It was overwhelmingly yes. I would say 80% yes. 20% no. Weren't even necessarily they disagree with the direction. Some do, but we're more so like, hey, we don't like the way the recommendations are said. Wording, they're not adequate enough, you know. And so but 80% yeah. So I think the important question, so we can wrap this up, is like, what does this mean for our church? What does this mean for the person listening? Well, the unfortunate negative that I would say is the greatest is a lot of money is going to be spent on this.
Right.
So while I agree that the money needs to be spent, the truth is getting lawyers are involved, policies are involved. That is consultants are involved. It's very expensive. So the initial cost of this is at least $3 million. So that's $3 million not going, I think the total budget is $100 million. So that's 3%, of money that's either not going to NAM or not going to IMB, those kind of things, which Send Relief, which is an IMB and NAM partnership, actually put that money forward. So basically Annie Armstrong, Lottie Moon gifts or designated gifts are going towards that. But it's going to cost a lot of money, and that affects, a number of missionaries going to the mission field and churches being planted. And that's a big pushback, but it's like,
I was thinking about the pushback for that, but I think in pictures and analogies, and I was just thinking, it is. So is it unfortunate that money has to be spent to do this? Yes. It is even more unfortunate that it happened in the first place. However, if you're in your house and you find that there's a crack in your foundation, that is not cheap to fix.
Yeah.
But if you don't fix it, you can still live in that house for a while and probably even deny that there's an issue.
Right.
But eventually, the house is going to fall.
Yeah.
And this, I think, is a foundational issue that does have to be addressed. And it does require, spending money to fix your foundation of your house means you're not going to do a lot of other things that you wanted to do with that money. But it also is the right thing to do.
Yeah, you're right. Liken it to the office building that we're having to build here on our church campus, which is $1 million, which is just stupid.
Right.
No, I don't mean our leaders made any stupid decisions. That's how much it costs.
The cost is the cost.
And I'm like, hey, I have this vision. Like, I don't want to spend $1 million on an office building.
Right.
Like, I didn't have an office for my first 6 years of being a pastor. I'm fine. Like, you and I kind of share that, but it's like, there's mold in this office. Like, it's being condemned.
We will get sick.
will get sued. Like, the best thing to do for the church is to do this. And we're in a position where we can do it, Yeah.
And for nuance and clarity's sake, just because it's 2022, we are not saying that anything that happened to an abuse survivor is like a foundation of that, but it's an analogy. So
that's what I was going to say. This is a more severe issue, so yes, we might plant less missionaries, but we're going to plant less sex offenders who are missionaries and sex offenders in churches. And so, that's a big thing. And then I think, again, the other way it'll affect your church is I just think there's a heightened awareness of this, and probably a more diligence about it, which I think is overall a good thing. I mean, our world views this differently too, and so there's the awareness of that. But I mean, ultimately, I think, if your church is handling things with integrity and involving the authorities when they need to, then it is going to be very limiting it's not going to be very limiting to the mission of the church. Unfortunately, any church who goes through this is it's going to happen in your church, and it's going to have a negative impact, and people are going to leave the church. But if you handle it with integrity and character, I think people will see that, and ultimately God sees that. Absolutely. And I think that's where we're at in the convention.
Yeah. So we're going to put a pin in this conversation here.
Pin in the conversation.
We're going
what does that mean?
It just means you're putting a pin in it. Like, literally, like, I'm coming back to this, or I'm going to continue this. We're going to pause.
Wouldn't that be an eraser?
I'm going to put a pause. We're going to erase. I wish we could.
No, you wouldn't erase. Wouldn't that be like a period in this
We're going to put a period in this conversation. Definitively never talk. No, just kidding.
That's true.
Yeah.
Comma?
We're going to pause. We're going to hit a pause.
I've just never heard that saying, put a pin in this conversation.
We're going to put a pin in it.
Really?
Yeah, because you kind of
You're always giving me your North Georgia colloquialisms, you know.
So, hey, we're going to pause right now. We're going to pick up with part 2. In part 2, we're going to be talking about some more of the things, some more issues that were addressed and kind of undercurrents in the Southern Baptist Convention.
Focus heavily on the conservative versus liberal thing next week.
Yes, it focus on the
to
conservative
get the
and liberal, the election, some of the other issues that came up and were voted on, talking about the seminaries, Saddleback was an issue, or was talked about, I should say, and even the ERLC. So we're going to talk some about those things in part 2. So join us for that.
Thanks for listening to Boggy Talk. We are so glad you joined in the conversation. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss a beat.